architecture of trust, the builders no one saw. It did not rise from stone or steel, and no skyline ever marked its completion. Yet this structure became one of the most powerful forces London ever created. Invisible to most, it shaped how fortunes were built, how crises spread, and how strangers learned to rely on one another without ever meeting. This was the architecture of trust, and it was engineered quietly by people history rarely names. London was growing faster than certainty could keep up. Trade crossed oceans. Credit stretched across months and years. Deals bound people who lived in different worlds and spoke different languages. In such a city, trust could no longer rely on familiarity or reputation alone. Something more durable was required. Something that could scale as fast as ambition itself. To understand why this mattered, we must return to a time when trust was personal and fragile. A handshake meant everything. A broken promise could end a family's livelihood. But as London expanded, these old bonds began to fail. Merchants needed to transact with strangers. Lenders needed assurances beyond instinct. The city needed a system that could replace personal trust with structural confidence. The reveal began not with grand theory, but with small innovations. Written contracts that outlived their creators. Ledgers that preserved memory beyond a single lifetime. Standardized terms that reduced ambiguity. Third parties who verified, recorded, and enforced agreements. None of this felt revolutionary at the time. It felt administrative. Boring, even, but together, these elements formed something unprecedented. Trust was being externalized. Instead of living inside individuals, it was embedded in systems. A deal no longer depended on who you were, but on whether you followed the rules. Reputation became portable. Obligation became transferable. Confidence no longer required familiarity, only compliance. This allowed London's financial world to grow far beyond the limits of human memory. Behind the scenes, quiet builders refined these systems. Clerks who standardized records. Lawyers who clarified obligations. Accountants who imposed consistency. Their work lacked drama, but its impact was immense. They were constructing an architecture that allowed trust to move faster than people ever could. Yet beneath the stability lay tension. If trust could be systematized, it could also be exploited. If confidence rested on structure rather than character, then those who understood the structure best could bend it. London was about to discover that invisible architecture can be just as dangerous as it is powerful. And the builders no one saw had laid foundations that would soon be tested. As these systems spread, London's financial world began to change its shape. Deals moved faster. Disputes diminished. Strangers traded with confidence once reserved for family. The architecture of trust was working, and that success encouraged expansion. More contracts, more credit, more distance between the people involved, and the promises binding them together. What made this transformation remarkable was its subtlety. No single law announced it. No institution claimed authorship. Trust migrated quietly from human judgment into procedures, documents, and routines. A signature carried weight not because of who signed it, but because the system recognized it. A contract mattered not because of goodwill, but because enforcement existed beyond personal relationships. This shift empowered a new class of participant. Those who understood the structure, how agreements were recorded, how obligations transferred, how disputes resolved, gained influence disproportionate to their visibility. Clerks, brokers, lawyers, and intermediaries became silent pillars of the city. They did not trade goods or sail ships. They maintained a framework that allowed everyone else to do so. But as reliance on structure deepened, so did vulnerability. The more trust lived inside systems, the less individuals questioned outcomes. Agreements were accepted because they were standard. Obligations rolled forward because procedures allowed them to. Few paused to ask whether the underlying assumptions still held. The system functioned smoothly until encountered pressure it was never designed to absorb. The first signs of strain appeared when disputes multiplied faster than resolution mechanisms could handle. Courts clogged, records conflicted. Different institutions interpreted the same obligation in incompatible ways. What had once simplified trust now introduced complexity few could fully see. Confidence persisted, but it rested on increasingly intricate foundations. Tensions sharpened when ambitious actors learned to navigate the architecture better than others. They structured agreements to shift responsibility invisibly. They layered obligations so risk moved elsewhere unnoticed. They exploited gaps between jurisdictions and standards. Nothing illegal occurred, nothing overtly dishonest. Yet outcomes grew uneven and resentment followed. Merchants began to sense that trust was no longer neutral. Some benefited consistently. Others absorbed losses they could not trace. The architecture felt solid, but its load was distributed unevenly. Those who understood its design prospered. Those who relied on it blindly paid the price. London was entering a phase where trust no longer depended on belief, but on interpretation. And interpretation favored those closest to the blueprint. The question was no longer whether the architecture of trust worked. It clearly did. The question was whether it could survive once people realized how easily it could be bent. The tension embedded in London's architecture of trust finally surfaced when the system faced pressure from every direction at once. Trade slowed, credit tightened, disputes surged. The very mechanisms designed to stabilize confidence were now overwhelmed by the volume and complexity they had enabled. What once felt like order began to resemble a maze. Merchants found themselves trapped in obligations they did not fully understand. Contracts referenced other contracts. Guarantees depended on conditions buried layers deep. When payments failed, no one could immediately identify responsibility. Trust had been abstracted so completely that accountability became diffuse. Everyone believed the system would protect them, until it didn't. Those who mastered the architecture moved quickly. They invoked clauses others overlooked. They shifted liabilities through procedural pathways invisible to outsiders. Courts became arenas where technical knowledge mattered more than fairness. Outcomes followed rules, not intuition. And while the rules had been designed to support stability, they now rewarded precision over equity. Frustration spilled into the streets and coffee houses. Traders accused intermediaries of designing traps disguised as safeguards. Smaller merchants complained that trust had become inaccessible, something owned by specialists rather than shared by the community. Confidence, once a collective asset, now felt privately controlled. Officials attempted to intervene, but even they struggled to grasp the full structure. Records conflicted. Jurisdictions overlapped. Authority fractured. The architecture had grown faster than oversight, leaving gaps no single institution could bridge. Each attempt at reform produced unintended consequences, shifting pressure rather than relieving it. The breaking strain came when a cluster of highly structured agreements failed simultaneously. Losses cascaded across multiple parties, each protected on paper, none protected in reality. The realization struck hard. Trust embedded in systems could multiply efficiency, but it could also multiply failure. London stood exposed to a paradox of its own creation. The city had replaced personal trust with architecture, only to discover that architecture required its own trust to function. And that trust was now eroding. The system would either adapt or fracture under the weight of its own complexity. The reckoning forced London to confront what trust truly meant in a system no longer guided by personal bonds. As disputes mounted and confidence thinned, the city realized that architecture alone could not carry belief. Procedures could record obligations, but they could not guarantee fairness. Rules can force outcomes, but they could not restore faith once it was lost. Reform arrived not as revolution, but as recalibration. Standards were simplified. Disclosure became mandatory. Layers of obligation were limited rather than celebrated. The city learned to slow the machinery it had once admired for speed alone. Trust, it turned out, required legibility as much as enforcement. People needed to understand the systems binding them, or they would abandon them. Institutions adjusted their roles. Intermediaries were brought under clearer oversight. Courts emphasized clarity over cleverness. Contract became shorter, not longer. The invisible builders returned to their work, refining the structure not to maximize advantage, but to restore balance. The architecture of trust was not dismantled. It was reinforced where it mattered most. Confidence returned gradually, not the blind confidence of early expansion, but a measured belief grounded in transparency. Merchants regained willingness to engage. Credit resumed its flow. The system survived not because it was perfect, but because it adapted. London emerged with a deeper understanding of its own creation. Trust could be engineered, but only within limits. Systems could scale belief, but only if people believed in the systems themselves. The unseen architects had built something extraordinary, but it required stewardship as much as design. The lesson endured quietly through every era that followed. Trust is not a structure you finish. It is one you maintain. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? Architects